context. That's why we're here. Oh, and thank you, Jazz. I don't know, I may have missed this at the top, just to let everyone know we are recording today's session. So if you need to do what you need to do to make yourself comfortable and change your name, come on and off video, all of that, please do it what you need. We'll be doing a tour of the dashboard, and so we want to use this as a little video tutorial you can reference back to. We also want to preserve the conversation we hope to engage with you all in. And again, I'm kind of blown away by everyone in the room. I'm gonna ask you about your relationship status with data in a second, and I gotta say, I'm feeling a little fun and flirty because I got a lot of you are doing incredible work. And I'm excited for you to be here and join in this conversation. So as Erica mentioned, I'm Sarah. I use she, her pronouns. I'm our Director of Research and Programs, and will be kind of the tour guide to the dashboard and helping facilitate the conversation we're going to have today about how to use data to advance equity and think about the stories we want to tell, how to change some of the stories that are being told, how to use data to look at systems rather than what survivors are doing in the landscapes that we're placed in. So the lay of the land is to do this tour, and I'm going to invite Portia, who Erica mentioned, to join me in pieces of that tour. We'll look through how it's laid out on our webpage and then give an actual demo of the dashboard. We're not going to get into the weeds of every single data point, every single dashboard, but kind of lay the roadmap and show you some pit stops and helpful tools you can use along the way as you use it. But please ask questions. We're going to hold some other trainings in October. We'll dig a little deeper with all of you. This is really to help you know how to access it, why it was built, what it looks like, and give you some time to develop your own relationship with the dashboard. And then we'll come back and have this conversation. So to get us started, thank you all so much for introducing yourselves in the chat. I'd also love to hear kind of what made you show up today. What do you want to talk about when it comes to data, when it comes to equity? What are you hoping to learn? What are you hoping to get out of the dashboard? Feel free to share some thoughts. They could be exclamations. They don't all have to be positive. You could be feeling nervous and a little trepidatious about what's happening. You might be an expert in this area and have lots to say about what we should be doing with data and how we use it for change. So we want to hear all of it. And to support that, we want to start off with a few polls to kind of get a sense of where everybody is coming at this, so that we all are starting off on a similar foot. So Jazz, if you could help run the first poll, it should show up as a pop-up, which is exactly that. What is your relationship status with data? And this is a little silly. Data, who's she? Don't know her, never met her, don't want to. Are you frenemies? It's complicated. Are you just friends? You do what you need. Perhaps you have a crush you just met, you're curious, you're excited. Maybe you've been in a relationship for a long time. Maybe that relationship is great. Maybe it's not so great. If it's something else, feel free to select that too and share more in the chat. If you want to explain your response, please do. So give a second while others complete this and then can share it. Okay, Jazz, I think we've got a critical mass. We can send it back, about 82% of you taking it. So we've got a pretty good mix from it's complicated to you all should be up here leading this conversation. So I'm really excited about that. I do want to note that we asked this question intentionally. I don't mean to be flippant about gender or about relationships and our relationship status. But we do this in part because we know that data can be presented as very masculine, unfeeling, elite, out of reach. Only certain people should or can interpret and do things with it. So this is sort of our invitation to all of you to do what you need, especially if you're more in the who, she, it's complicated, have a tenuous relationship with it, to unpack that a little bit and give yourself permission to use data as part of the story and the work that you are trying to do. So I look forward to hearing a little bit about that. We've got folks that work specifically on economic empowerment and look at data for that and probably gather. I know we've got researchers in the room, we've got policymakers in the room. So share more about what you're doing, because I know it'll help others in the room, and we've got diverse experience here, which is what we're going for. Okay, we've got one other poll. Now we want to know how you primarily or currently use data in your real life. We're kind of creating a forced choice here. I know that some of you probably do many of these things. So what is the primary thing that you do? Maybe you don't really use it. Maybe you only use it as required, or you need to report it. Maybe you do make decisions about programs, about policies, use it in your advocacy or to fuel your advocacy, or other ways entirely. So give you a moment to think about that. And while you're responding, I'd also love to hear in the chat, how would you like to be using data? And is that different from how you're currently using it? Or how would you like us as a collective, as the field, to be using data or leveraging data in ways that can create a bigger, better, more equitable impact for the communities that you live in and serve? What would you like to see happen with data? And this is an important question. Keep it in your back pocket. Think about it, even if you can't chat about it right now. We'll come back to this when we dive into discussion, because that's really what we're here for. So now let's see these results. A lot of folks use it because they're required to. And I bet you have a lot of strategies about how you make it meaningful in doing that and what you would like to do differently. Not so many folks using it to make decisions about funding policy or programs. Some do use it to advocate for systems change. That's interesting. Did folks have thoughts about, does this match with what you thought you would see in a room like this? Any reactions to these polls? Some are admittedly not great at data. We want data in our individual advocacy reports to be better utilized. So how can the data we're required to share kind of come back in reciprocity? Love that. Native American peoples included in data sovereignty. I know that Portia is going to talk a little bit about that. And that is something we've grappled with the dashboard for sure. Appreciate all of that. Okay. Thank you for that. So before I dive into the actual tour of the dashboard, I wanted to kind of revisit the questions that Erica touched on. Why equity and why data, and why we landed on this dashboard and are talking about it today. To do that, I'm actually, since we're talking about data, I'm going to share a poem, because that continue. This is a poem by Alok Menon, who's a trans activist and poet that I thought really resonated with me. I heard it the other day. We talk a lot in this work about how we shift the gaze from, as Erica mentioned, from individuals to systems. And sometimes that can feel really abstract and unspecific, and we don't know what that means. And I think putting it into this feeling really resonated. So what they say is, one day when I die, rewind the heart attack. What power precipitated it? Unfurl the tumor. What policy prescribed it? Dissect the culture, not my corpse, and diagnose the world. Hold one big stethoscope to it and listen. I hope that resonates with some. Our hope for the dashboard, not only the dashboard, but with the Mapping and Advancing Equity project writ large, is that it will shift that gaze. And this also points to the question of why data? We have data that can illuminate these harms. We have data that shows what the landscapes survivors are moving in look like, even if we have limited data on their own experience, which sometimes can be turned to even further victimize or harm or blame them for their own behaviors. So data is one way, not the only way that we can act and that we can listen. Both rethinking how we interpret and build narratives around the world and our understanding of it, and how that informs our outward advocacy. The other question and the reason why data is because we know that data sets are stories, they're incomplete stories, they're selective stories, and they're told by certain people on how they interpret and realize their world. And so from redlining to AI to how we can use the data in this dashboard, we're interested in kind of changing the story that is told about survivors and what we can do with data to facilitate that. The final thing, and you'll see this in our website when we get into it, for those of you who are a little more data-minded and infographic focused or visually focused, this is the inequitable landscape that Erica describes so beautifully at the opening. And how safety costs and creates disparities in who can access it. But it's not only immediate access to safety, but that over generations, both wealth and poverty have been concentrated with certain populations and certain people. That services gatekeep rather than create bridges. And more often than not, we hear from you all and for survivors that looks like the time it takes to navigate. We know all of this is rooted explicitly and is also has kind of more insidious roots and manifestations in our racism and patriarchy in our system, from redlining to more modern day racial bias and child removals. And we know that folks experience state violence and many forms of oppression that really teach us how to exploit one another rather than to give and honor all of our respective humanities. So that works to recreate and reproduce racial and economic inequity writ large and increase very particular and pronounced forms of violence. So all of that is why we built the dashboard. We really wanted to create this as an offering, for a tool that paints the picture of inequity, that shines the light on those systems that precipitate our harm and suffering, and ultimately fuel our advocacy for change. Who is it for? It's for all of you. So I'm really thrilled that you're here today to help us think through how it can be useful to your work immediately and in the longer term. We know that statewide coalitions are uniquely positioned to mobilize radical economic and social change. We know that on-the-ground advocates and programs, especially survivor and community of color-led, need to access their data, face particular data burdens to sustain and quote unquote legitimize their work in some instances, and need to be leading and engaged in systems change efforts and hold systems accountable. And we know that funders, as Erica mentioned, many want to create equitable pathways and to meaningfully look at the intersection of racial, gender, and economic inequity, not only in what is addressed, but in how funding can kind of model that. At the core of this is an equity project, are some values. All of the partners that Erica mentioned got together early in this work to make sure that the work in building the dashboard was really solidified and sound in some core values that at the end of the day talk about our belief that data is more than statistics, but tell an important story. So the dashboard currently presents presents quantitative information, but we believe that stories, that policy outcomes, that the particular way that people practice and enact policies matter, the ways that you all build community, engage in change. Those stories are important data, and we hope to work with you all to build that in. So I'm going to invite Portia, who Erica mentioned, to kind of touch on these, because not only are these values for our dashboard, but we thought helpful guideposts as you encounter other research and data and examine who created it, who controls it, who gets to make decisions about it, whether it's relevant, and how it can be useful. So Portia has been with us this year, not only to build the dashboard, but really give us that a really sound and equity in data science perspective, and bring that expertise. They currently work in civic engagement spaces, have worked with the federal government, in nonprofits, doing economic work, poverty work, hunger work, environmental work, working globally, domestically, in political spaces, in nonpartisan spaces. So Portia, I know you wanted to, I'd love if you kind of touched on some of these values and how they show up in the dashboard, and how folks might be able to incorporate them in their broader sense of and work with data.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm really excited to be here with y'all, and really grateful to have worked with CSAJ on this dashboard effort. And I apologize that I'm not on camera today. I have a computer that temporarily I'm on that's not set up for video, but I would like to acknowledge what Erica and Sarah have already covered about how we are really focused on equity, and we know that because of the gender and racial discrimination and historically inequitable systems in this country, that there are a lot of biases in the data. And I know you can't see me, but I'm a Black woman in this space, and I think it can be it's important to have people from communities and that reflect the community who are involved in the space to kind of come with that lens when we're looking at this data. So I just want to touch on a couple of these before we move on to the tour. And I'll start with the centering people and places, which I think we've addressed a little bit. I like to think of this using a model that I'm learning more about myself, but from I'll provide a definition from the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, and the model is Indigenous Data Sovereignty. And the way that they define it is it's supported by Indigenous peoples' inherent rights of self-determination and governance over their peoples, territories, and resources, as affirmed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as well as in domestic treaties. So it's basically recognizing that data is a strategic resource and provides a framework for the ethical use of that data to advance the collective Indigenous well-being and self-determination. I think oftentimes when there are, and we'll see, I think one of the things that the dashboard services will highlight, when there are marginalized communities and the data is not robust, a lot of the onus and sort of almost a sense of blame is placed on that community when they're perfectly reasonable, reasons, that are historic, and why communities may not want to engage in providing data. If you were, if that data has been used to harm you in the past, if you're an undocumented person, or you're, for the LGBTQ community, depending on where you live, you may be hesitant to provide data to certain entities. So I think that framework has to shift, and instead of placing blame on the community, to figuring out how the communities are able to own that data, have provided with their consent, understand how it's being used, and to make sure that it's not being used in a way that is going to be harmful to them. And that also, I think, leads into the transparency value as well. I think a lot of times data is collected, and there's a lot of talk about big data, but you're not sure how it's being used, where it's going. So again, I think having that ownership over data when it's coming from the communities, to be able to say like who's using it and why, is very important. And then I think this also leads into the data as being a tool. I think I'll kind of dovetail these two tools, and not the entire answer, and how data is very powerful. So data, I think I really believe in data being democratized, but in a safe and transparent way. There can be, historically gatekeeping of certain types of data, or, we have a wealth of data that's available to us publicly, but it's not always easy to access. And then sometimes there are private entities that charge for this data where folks may not be able to, they may not have the resources to access it. And so again, I think what this dashboard does is take a number of these data sets and put them in one place so that it's very, sort of concise and convenient as well. And then to talk about data as a tool, we use one of the data sets, and again, we'll get into this more, I think, during the training, but one of the more prominent data sets that we're using in the dashboard comes from the Census Department. And the census, I'm sure in 2020, everybody heard like how important the census is, and like make sure you, there was a big push to make sure people were providing data. And, it's used to, of course, and everything from apportioning resources to localities and redistricting. So it's very powerful in that way. But again, there can be ways that it's, depending on where it's used, that can be used to harm. So if we look at what's happening right now in Alabama, for instance, in gerrymandering, where there are efforts to dilute the voting power of Black and Brown folks down there, when a large portion of the state is made up of Black and Brown folks. And so again, like the data is saying, like, okay, there should be more than one district of BIPOC folks here, but that's not happening at the moment. But I think that's just an example of sort of the flip side of the coin, where data is being used and not in a way that's not equitable. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it back to you, Sarah, so we can move to it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the framing of data sovereignty and learning from Indigenous folks and folks who have been excluded or harmed by data. I think that kind of mirrors how we want to kind of use this to figure out what is the story that we want to tell that will counteract or create the world and create safety as it should be, and what is required to create it. And I think building off of those frameworks, and I know from earlier some folks in the chat were talking about that similarly, so I'd love any reaction you have, and as we get into discussion, would love to think with you about how to enhance even our current dashboard and build on it, and think about how we can gather additional data, how we can make sense of it, so that it is speaking for and from and on behalf of these frameworks and communities. So thank you for that. So let's get into it. First, I'm going to lay the roadmap, and then I'll have Portia demo the dashboards again. So to give you a broad sense of how it's laid out in our website, we don't only have data. It's packaged on our website, and so it comes with some helpful, what I would call pit stops, to help you think through the data, apply it, learn with it, and share back with us kind of your own stories. So it's more than just the data dashboard. So I want to give a broad sense of what that looks like, and then head over to our website so you can see how you can access it and work through these tools. So as Erica mentioned, this dashboard is not the only thing we're working on, but is part of our Mapping and Advancing Equity project writ large. This, along with Mona will, I'm sure, touch on this later. These are not the only initiatives of this work, but the policy platform coming out later this year, that is Survivor and Advocate, co-developed, I view really as the sail that will guide us into the future. And this data is part of the wind that we hope will fill it for all of us. So, and the maps are organized in a series, in a 3-part series, with the aim to really connect the dots. So not only provide data in these areas, but also connect the dots between violence, safety, and whether and to what extent our services, funding, and policies meet those needs. So let's dig into those maps a little bit. Map 1 provides data in 2 dashboards, looking at who lives in our state, what is the story of our state, How can we use this data to articulate the story of the culture of our state and therefore what safety requires? This really uses census and other general demographic data to identify the diverse communities that make up our states that we know survivors are a part of. So we're looking at the broad demographic landscape. The landscape of violence shares data on rates of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, femicide, and some related experiences of data, looking across race and gender and other demographics where available to really show who's most impacted by violence in our states. So map 2 is the meaty or the peanut butter and jelly-y part of this sandwich. I realize as I say that I'm using a lot of different metaphors, so sorry, or I hope it's helpful, or some of them, one of them are helpful to you. These help ask and address the question, who has access to safety in our state writ large? And therefore, how do we know if survivors can access it and navigate it? Who has access to economic security, housing, child well-being, education, employment, other opportunity, health? Who doesn't? These 5 landscapes were built off of CSAJ's framework of the economic ripple effect of violence. We use a mix of census, economic, some experimental data, and in some cases, data specific to survivors' experiences, with hopes to grow there in the future to really understand if these safety needs are being met in each state and who has access to them. So since we're not going to get into the weeds of what types of data are in each of these landscapes today, I wanted to give like the broad framework of what exists. So with the exception of the economic security landscape, data is organized as access indicators. So looking at who has access to resources within these areas and what are outcomes in these areas, paying specific attention to disparities in both. So just to give a few examples, housing access indicators look like median rent, requests for shelter from NNEDV's census. Outcomes include both likely and actual eviction rates, homelessness. In the child and family well-being landscape, access includes childcare costs, child support cases, domestic relations case rates. Outcomes include child poverty, food insecurity, child removal rates. In employment and education, we're looking at access to unemployment insurance, educational attainment, even U visa approval rates, tapping into work authorization, and outcomes include and underemployment. And then finally, in the health landscape, access might look like things like medical insurance, as well as access to mental health providers. Outcomes include self-reported health status of women across race, as well as some data specific to IPV survivors, self-reported health status as well. Economic security landscape is a little different, not because there aren't access and outcome indicators, but it's a little broader. So that's organized in 3 different ways. We're looking at concentrated disadvantage, which is sort of a composite term whose factors have been studied and shown to be associated with increased rates of intimate partner violence, and really talk about the disadvantage we've been talking about today. These factors compound poverty, unemployment, availability of public benefits, diversity of a state, and if inequity follows that. And so therefore gives a score on whether or not states could be characterized as having high disadvantage or lower rates of disadvantage, meaning do survivors or people in general have access to those different factors. We also look at economic security from income and poverty to wealth. So looking at immediate income as well as wealth gaps that we know are more enduring, and at the consumer burden. So amounts and types of debt that are available in or that exists in different states, and to what extent the state population has access to different financial related resources. all of this, we know our needs that survivors have, that they tend to be overrepresented in communities that face barriers to all of this. And so that's how the safety landscape is really set up. I know that there's a lot there. I'm sorry for rattling that off. But once you get into it, I hope that that kind of gives you a sense of how it is, how it's set up. I'm not going to talk too much about map 3. This is probably, you know, the glue, the synergistic part. And this is the part that we need all of you for, starting next year with the platform and based on this initial rollout of the dashboard. How do we build and connect the dots between policies that exist in our state and tie them to the outcomes that we're seeing in our states? And how do we expand our thinking to build in more service-related data and examine funding streams to see to what extent we're meeting survivors' needs versus driving services based on what's available. We have been partnering with folks at Also who provide support and TA to state administrators of the STOP VAWA funding stream. So we do have links to connect with them or to connect with your state administrator to start looking at that data and kind of expanding what that looks like in the future. So with that, let's go to the website and see how you can take a look at all of this. Here is CSAJ's website. So after this, we will make sure to send you the direct link to the dashboard, but I want to show you how you can navigate to it just from our website, csaj.org. Everything that I mentioned is under the Our Work tab. You can see the larger Mapping and Advancing Equity project page is here, and you can also go directly to this landing page. Because of all of this is still being finalized, so it's moving a little slow. This goes through everything I just kind of talked through. So it has the links to each of the 3 maps where you can then unfurl the layers. It shares the why equity, why data, the infographic that I mentioned, lays out the values so you know where we're coming from and can build that into your work, gives a little bit more information on who it's for and how we think you can utilize it, ways to get involved, resources, and a few notes on our methodology so that we're transparent about our approach. So that's the landing page. You can always come back to this to start over and to go where you want to go. So I'll show some of our additional tools in map 1 and then invite Portia to come back in with the economic dashboard to show you how the dashboards themselves work. So within each of these, we have some additional tools. We give some context at the top. Then we embed the dashboards right into this site. Something really helpful that might be good to look at immediately is this methodology doc that shares all some definitions, all of our data, so you get like the full picture of the data and the sources that we use in each of the dashboards. Here are the tips. We have all of these accordion things where you can expand and retract information, questions to help you to keep in your back pocket as you're exploring the data, as well as some tips for actually how to use the different dashboards that are here. Here's the first one on the population landscape where you can see state information broken down by these different demographic groups. You can get a state-to-state comparison, see where your state kind of sits in the grand scheme, get some interpretation. This is dynamic, so hover over everything, use drop downs, click on things. It can't be broken. You can always refresh the page if it gets a little wonky. And then we also have information, a glance at some intersections, looking at the general population, poverty, and rates of violence across race and gender. Here's where we provide additional resources. We know not everything and not all the intersections we would like to show exist in the dashboard. And there are some additional tools either that provide more county or local level information you want, or help you look more specifically at, for example, the LGBTQ plus population in different states, getting some dashboards on native lands and tribal nations across the country as well. And then similarly, we have our landscape of violence with some supplemental resources. I don't have to tell all of you that there's not a lot of state level data on different communities who experience violence and the impacts. And so we also provide some helpful resources that you can go to that will hopefully start your own journey on how you can build on the dashboard and how you might supplement it with your own data. It kind of works like a website. You can click on the buttons and change it to look at sexual assault versus femicide. Again, hover over things to get a sense of what the data means. Use all the information here to help you interpret what it means and what some limitations might be as well. Then you can use the tools and the little guides at the top of the web page to go to map 2. All of these tools and helpful tools are available for each of the maps. This overarching safety landscape points you to those 5 areas that I mentioned. So let's go to economic security. And from here, you can see again the explanation of the 3 categories that we group data in, some other information, and then the embedded dashboard. And I'll have Portia talk about that. Another tool that we offer that is useful in a couple ways is after the dashboard, there's a seeding advocacy section. So as I mentioned, stories are important. We hope that this can help you craft your story and put the data to use. We ask that you share your state and territory. It asks questions that you can think about so that you know how the data can help you tell that story, either of what your state culture is like or what violence or safety requires in your state. You can answer or respond to any of these. You can also request help, and only if you do that will we ask you for your email, and then we'll get in touch with you. So this is our way of connecting with you to figure out to support you with any individual needs you might have around data, and to help you craft stories, as well as for those who use a lot of data, use it in your advocacy, want to see different data, want to share your stories of change. We have a space for that too. So our hope is not only to connect and engage with you, but to use these stories that you submit to really transform the dashboard in the future from a data dashboard to a really powerful advocacy toolkit. So we're sharing what you all do with each other and with the field at large. So, and again, the supplemental resources. So those are some of the pit stops and tools that I wanted to highlight as you navigate the dashboard. And then you can always go back to the main map too, to go directly to the safety landscape that you want. You can also scroll through to the next one and go to map 3 and get links to connect with partners and so on. So I'm going to stop sharing there. I'm seeing some stuff in the chat. And I want Portia to give a little demo of how the safety landscape dashboards function. And then we'll break and we'll kind of take a breath and take a step back and talk about advocacy.
Hey, thank you, Sarah. Sorry, I was responding to some questions in the chat. And I think some folks are ahead of us. And thank you so much for your feedback and questions. And one of the things that we wanted to ask were about additional data sets. And of course, if there's other data that y'all would recommend or data that speaks specifically to survivors, please feel free to share that with us as well. So let me share my screen here. Cooperate. Right. Is everyone able to see that? And I'm sorry, I can't see y'all. I'm working off of one screen, so someone can just give me a verbal yes and I'm
Yeah, it looks great.
okay. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so I think someone asked in the chat as well, what's the dashboard, what BI software was built on using. So we use Tableau for this, and you know, feel free to come up to me if you have questions about that as well. So I'll just do a very high level overview of the economic stability security dashboard. I know that Sarah's mentioned that in October there will be 2 trainings, so we'll deep dive into the other dashboards in the series and the data that's contained in those dashboards. So we are really compiling a lot of different sources, so I won't go into all of those, but just kind of touch on how the dashboard is laid out and then later how it can be used. So at the very top of the dashboard here, we have these filters that are sort of a cascading hierarchy. There are different indicators, and we've tried to, because there is so much in the dashboard, be very descriptive. You can see these sort of info bubbles where you can hover and it'll provide information about what is contained in each of these categories. We also have the documentation that Sarah mentioned previously that's linked here to provide even further information on all of the indicators. But this is just some guidance on the use and then what is contained here. So these, you can select a indicator here. So I'm going to select households with cash public assistance from the economic indicator variable. I'm sorry, it might be a little bit slow the first time it runs. I feel like cash is, but that's Tableau. But. And then the if there are demographic factors, those will appear. If there are race and ethnicity data associated with the particular indicator, that will appear. And if there is a year, that will also appear. So we, again, we don't have data for every, like not every variable has a demographic component or a race and ethnicity component, but again, it's like giving you a broad look of what's available, and then, you know, where there may be gaps. Over here on the left side, there is a description of the context for each landscape. So as you change the indicator, it will provide some more details here. There's a heat map in the middle. So if you hover on that map, there is a tooltip with the particular variable. And if there's, again, the subcategories of demographic information will be reflected, as well as the state population to provide some more context. You may see some blank boxes, and that's where there may not be data for a particular state or territory, and or it's present in a different year. We also try to, because the most granular level that we have for most of this data is the state level. Sometimes it's at the county level, to provide a comparison, because we don't really have it at, you know, county or we can't aggregate to a regional level. We just added a state comparison here. We can really see how the states cluster together, if there are any outliers. So in this case, you know, Alaska is showing up as, you know, on the higher end of this households with cash to public assistance. We also added a way to sort from, and you can change here the number that you want to display, but the number of states from top to bottom to give another sort of point of comparison. And then within this, that loads, within this, you can also hover, and there's information about OVW funding by year, as well as the variable again at the top of the stack. We can also drill down to the state level. If we click on a state for a bit more information, where we'll see each state IPV rates by race, and you can toggle between domestic violence category and then the sexual assault category. And then there's demographics that are broken down by age, disability, gender, households with children, immigration, language, whether it's a rural population, and sexuality. And so then again, just giving a different lens to look at on a state level. here. So I'll turn to the overview.
Okay.
Pause here for any questions or.
Thanks for that tour, Portia. I saw someone ask that you're seeing not found. Yeah, that's we are just finishing up some things, so they're still in private mode. So you'll see the mapping equity and the dashboard in our work menu, but all of the pages will show up as not found. Once we go through it after this launch, we'll make sure that everything is finally functioning and we'll turn them to live. So you'll get a direct email from us when that is the case so that you can go back in and actually start touring through it on your own and tinkering around in there. So that is the big picture and how it's packaged in our website, tools to help you navigate it, tools to help you share your story and what else you need from us and ways to engage. And now I'd love, and I know that that's a lot. So we have, we'd love your feedback on this and to hear how you are already thinking about it, other data you'd like to see and ways you want to engage with us. I want to take a little break so we can all take a deep breath and then come back and kind of dive into discussion together about not only the dashboard, but how data and generally and how our collective work can be used to create the change and create new stories that we're trying to tell. So Jazz, if you could drop that link if folks want to respond to that. If you all have questions and you want to drop them in the chat, either about the dashboard or that you want to have conversation around, please drop those in the chat and then we'll pick back up. Let's take a little bio break. So 3 minutes. Give everybody a second to decompress and have some conversation. So thank you so much.
Hopeful that so I'm hopeful that we will find better ways of getting human trafficking data, because right now we don't have a lot of them. And there's actually a bill that's in process, and I don't remember the name of the bill, but it's on the federal level, but it's specific to gathering data on human trafficking, and they're very specific on like identifying what the barriers to getting that data is, and the bill addresses how to address those barriers that we can get accurate data. But it just seems like a really difficult task to find that. So I'm grateful that y'all are building this dashboard, and selfishly I hope that somehow we can get some HT specific data on there too.
Yeah, that makes me think that I really do view this as like the baseline, and there's a lot of doing work in connection to identify what other data do we need, how can we creatively gather it, collect it to ease burdens and to lift up those experiences. So I'd love to be on those conversations. And that actually makes me want to pull you in, Portia. I feel like what Sarah was just saying is sort of an example of how data is essential for doing the work of equity. So moving from kind of where are we in equity, how can we use data to look at systemic structural inequity, to how do you think data is essential in the doing of our equity work?
Absolutely, thanks, Sarah. So I'm going to share my screen again to try to, using a dashboard, sort of unpack where we may be able to find some patterns of inequity and like ask questions around it. And I think Wolf raised this earlier in the chat that survivors' data might not always make it into publicly available data, so that is a challenge. But I think that is one of the things that we'd like to address eventually. So I'm going to share my screen, and please let me know if everyone's able to see that. Okay.
It's not,
So I'm looking at,
not showing up
nope,
quite yet.
not yet.
I don't know if it's just
Okay,
processing
let me give
or,
it a moment to think. Yeah. Sometimes Zoom doesn't like to cooperate. Let me try again. I'll start and reshare. Okay, how about now?
still no, for some reason.
It's showing me that I'm sharing, but okay. I mean, I can sort of talk through
Oh,
it.
there it
It's
goes.
just not going to. Oh, I'm
Oh.
impatient. Okay, sorry about that, y'all. Let's see.
There it is. Sorry about that. We
Okay,
got
we're
there.
good. All right. Yeah, third time. No, it's all me. It's all my computer being uncooperative. Okay. So I wanted to take a look at the dashboard and just think through, like, give an example of how, with the caveat that we know not all survivor data may show up, but just kind of using this as a launching point, and you make, some inferences, of course, knowing folks on the ground in these communities have the real grounding and know what's happening and can use this sort of as a guide. So, I took a look, and I'm not picking on Mississippi. I'm from the South. I'm just taking a look at Mississippi and the poverty rate in the state, which in 2021 was 14%. I think it's higher now. I think so. In Mississippi in 2021 was the state with the highest poverty rate. I think in 2022 is the highest. So I looked at that, and then in conjunction with one of the social safety net programs, like households with cash and public assistance, disclosed, and noted that Mississippi only had 2.1% of households that were receiving public cash assistance income. And I know there are other programs as well, but I was wondering, based on it being the second highest, the state with the second highest poverty level, why there's such a small percentage of folks that are receiving social safety nets and what the barriers to access are. And so, just doing some sort of cursory research, looking at, for instance, another program like the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which is a block grant, a federal block grant, and I'm sure you'll know this, so I'm just going to briefly touch on it. That's $100 million a year, intended to serve for families. And even though Mississippi had increased the funding of 2021, because of the barriers to this program, there's a lot of red tape, there's a lot of punitive policies. Folks may move, they may have exhausted the eligibility for it. Mississippi has very strict sanctions. So if someone misses an appointment with a caseworker, they may throw you off of the program for doing that once. They also punish entire households with these sorts of regulations. So I think, that's just like an idea of how to kind of launch into what are the structural sort of barriers and inequities that, folks are facing, and that might also apply to, survivors in these communities as well. So just using that as an example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. What I see in that is it can kind of point to the it's like the factor, and even the how it can be used in the doing of equity is even asking the question that data may not point to all the information or the thing that's wrong, but it may help kind of frame the question and know who to ask that to, which makes me want to be in. Yeah, no, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Oh, yeah. Well, one other thing I wanted to add, and I think, it's so important that we're continuing to have the equity conversation around data. I meant to speak to this earlier, but especially with sort of the conversation around AI, and it's, I'm hearing it more and more in data spaces, and it's being used, in places like where marginalized people are already being targeted, like within law enforcement. Like there was an incident in Detroit, I think in February, where there was a Black pregnant person who was misidentified through facial recognition technology. And so there are cases where communities that are already over-policed. These sorts of technologies are being used. And so I think we have to, as they are continuing to be deployed without any regulation as of yet, really lean into spaces to make sure that data isn't going to be sort of siphoned up without attribution or compensation or any sort of transparency into just a Silicon Valley black box, and then used to target people in a way that's harmful instead of, it's being used in employment to sort through resumes and things of that nature. Again, there's already like inherent bias in a lot of this data. So I think that's just important to highlight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for that. So that idea of using the dashboard to like kind of point to indicators and to ask questions makes me think of, okay, and I know questions that folks have in this room and are expert at doing is, so what do we do about it? And I want to hear from everyone. So calling in Mona on this first. So with the dashboard or with data generally in your work with the collective learning group and the survivor advocacy work, your past work, working with and on a statewide coalition, how can we use the data in our policy and legislative work? What are some things that coalitions can do? How can we think about that?
Yeah, big questions. And I think Portia did a really great job of kind of teeing up the conversation and making the connections between our system inequities and what those impacts look like on the ground for survivors. And what I think is really important about the conversation we're having today is not only are we talking about the data that's in the dashboard, right? The numbers, the maps, the population landscape. But a part of this unique piece of this project is that we are really doing work with people. And we know that survivor stories and people's stories are really at the crux of being able to tell a really holistic story through not only data, but the experience that people have on this call, the advocates on the call, survivors that we are working with every day, as well as folks that are working with survivors outside of our kind of quote unquote traditional service provision. So through our practice and our work here, we're working through our collective learning process, which has been a culmination of a few different collective learning gatherings with advocates that are working in the domestic violence field, as well as survivor advocates, so folks who are doing the work every day to support survivors and also have experienced violence themselves. And so they've shared what this quote unquote data looks like, the anecdotal experiences that they're experiencing, what survivors are telling them in their work. And we've been able to really kind of get an understanding of what our storytelling data is also telling us. And so we're seeing a lot of similarities of what the dashboard data is showing. And we're seeing bigger, broader context of what the issue areas are that we're seeing. And so as we're talking about system inequities, we're seeing them discussed and described and identified, right, in both the dashboard itself. And we're also seeing and hearing that from our folks that were part of our collective learning process. And so I think one of the important pieces of this effort is really to be able to complement data that's in the dashboard, that's hard, quote unquote, hard data somewhere alongside people's experiences, survivor experience, and people during the work, and being able to translate that into something that we can kind of quote unquote do something with, right? And so our work is centered around advocacy, and that looks a lot of different ways. A lot of the work that I'm really hoping to move forward is within our policy and legislative work. And that's really core kind of work. It's in that field, it's the bread and butter is to do, the policy work and the legislative work. And so we need to know, how do we translate this, both our storytelling, our anecdotal work, our trends that we're seeing in programs, as well as this data into practical use. So kind of the bread and butter is policy advocacy. So we can use information from the dashboard in more tangible ways. So whether that be through statistics or through comparisons that we're seeing across states, We can use that kind of in written or oral testimonies. A lot of folks will go to their state or federal legislature and be able to speak before their different representatives to advocate on a particular issue. So I think that's a really tangible way of kind of, bringing this information down to really tangible ways and kind of bite-sized pieces of information that we can contextualize in different ways. I think another way that I think that this information can be helpful and supportive to our field is from the national level, not just the advocacy lens, but also thinking about it from a systems lens. And again, this project is really based in looking at system inequities. And those systems means that there are different industries or different kind of pieces that are connected. So if we're talking about housing or eviction, we're going to be identifying those different systems and industries. So we're talking finance, right? Who has access to buy or purchase things, credit industries, who has, access to be able to look at a credit report that gains or denies access to rental. And data and information. So where are those eviction records coming from? And oftentimes our state and federal governments are often different systems that are also intersecting with that. So how do we look at those different systems and look at it through a regulatory or administrative lens? And then prioritize how can we do advocacy through that way. It's sometimes a little bit of that kind of unsung hero advocacy, but it's really important. So not only can we look at the data in the dashboard, as well as our collective stories through passing laws, getting in front of our representatives, but also on the regulatory lens. I think one of the other pieces that is really key here, and this goes back to our values and where we really want to be people-centered, is around mobilization and organizing. So if you're recognizing a pattern through the dashboard that 4 or 5 states in an area, maybe you've got a region where this one issue area is coming into fold. How can you mobilize around the specific area? And connect with other people, other organizations who might be doing the same work to then create regional and or kind of national initiatives to center around. So I think that's a few kind of policy pieces and kind of legislative items that we could, really use in the more practical way around this work.
Thank you so much. I love that, from identifying commonality, common cause, to organizing, to digging in more and getting more specific. I know we're at time, and I know folks, if they have to hop off, please do. But Erica, I want to pull you in and final thoughts on similar question, but for coalitions, small c, or other kinds of coalitions, for funders. How can we use this? I know we have funders in the room, government funders, private funders, our funder. If others have thoughts about how this can be used to serve their work, please share that, what folks have done to work with their funders. I'm really curious about this conversation that we know, as we heard earlier, is really critical to doing and sustaining the work and in new ways. So how can data be used in funding equity? Erica, thoughts on that?
Erica?
Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thinking about it in terms of how to inform program work, it kind of goes back to the point that I had made earlier today around alignment, trying to align the resources that we have with what we know about needs. So in the context of a program, that can take the shape of using the landscape that we gather from the data dashboard to really sharpen our priorities. It could take the form of creating program policies that place priority on impacted populations and particular economic justice issues that are really at the root of survivor safety. It could also help us in mapping where our gaps are as programs, whether that's in the form of funding or partners or training related needs, so that we can make sure that we are, again, going back to that concept of alignment, directing our programmatic resources and advocacy in the directions and with all that we need to target those needs. From a funder perspective, I think that funders are perfectly positioned to use the dashboard to create impact. And a lot of that, again, depends on funders' priorities. If you're a funder that cares about equity, the dashboard offers tools to help you allocate resources to kind of be the change that you want to see in this world. So that may mean deprioritizing certain areas that we know are less important or even harmful to survivor communities, and redirecting them to strategies that survivors are telling us they need to be safe, whether it's in the space of economic justice or restorative justice or other survivor-driven initiatives. It can also mean setting strategic priorities that are focused on creating systems change work, funding programs that are deliberately aware of the need for structural change. So with that, though, I do know that there are several funders on this call. I'm not sure, Charisse, if you are still with us, but would love your reaction if you are. I'm just looking through. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I would open it up to folks in the audience, both from the program perspective and the funder perspective. Would love to hear all of your thoughts around how the dashboard can be leveraged, both in the program space and from a funder perspective, how you envision it being helpful.
Agreed. Any kind of final words, thoughts from you all? How you are using it, how you'd like to, what other conversations you'd like to have around it?
I can say something if no one else wants to. So something that survivors of human trafficking are telling us a lot is how these systemic issues affect human trafficking and are the root causes of human trafficking. And I think that if we can have that data to show, like, this many people are affected by these issues in this area, it can help us to, because we know that survivors are the subject matter experts and we want them to lead this movement and hear them. But sometimes when you are writing grant or grant requests, you need that cold, hard data to show that. And I think that this will really go a long way in kind of showing the evidence behind what they already know.
I appreciate that. And I'm hearing in the chat too that we need to look at prevention and healing in addition to response. Yeah, I think that I totally, if you want to say more about that, please come off mute and do that. We got a similar question in the RS as folks were registering for this about, to what extent are survivors' capacity for joy, innovation, community also captured alongside the harms. So the dashboard really paints the picture of what is. I think it's a great question and a great task for all of us to paint the picture of what could or should be. So how do we engage in that? And like I said, create that alternative story. What is the story? How do we do that? What data is available that taps into that for us? How do we make sense of it? So that feels like a really good question to sit with. I don't know if you want to say more about that, Elizabeth.
I'll just say that as we as a field try to shift more towards healing and prevention, I would love to see more ways to try to measure that. And I think that's one of the hardest things in trying to get funding and support for those types of resources and services and that type of work is there's not a great way to capture it. And even if we see reports going down, that may not be reflective of incidents. And we just get a lot of pushback, like, oh, well, we had a peak of reports in 2018. It's like, well, yeah, that like makes sense if we think about the what was happening with Me Too and everything. And then people didn't necessarily find that was the right thing for them. And so this reduction in reports doesn't necessarily mean there's less sexual violence specifically for my sake. And so, yeah, I would just love to like better be able to capture that somehow, even if it's on, you know, a bigger level than we could get at like sort of a local or population level. Does that make sense? Hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And I think that part of what we're hoping to do is we know that reporting to systems, we know that self-reporting is fraught in this space for the reasons, some of the reasons you mentioned, and what is going, which is exactly what we're talking about. What is going on that makes safety harder to access, what is changing in our different landscapes we've done it together through the pandemic. It happens in unique and distinct ways. And how do we understand what that is, and also point to the things that are working and that survivors want. And thanks, Olivia, for sharing an article that might help us think about how we do measure that. And I know that I was talking to someone, I think it's actually from Allstate, similarly on how we think about kind of capacity and measure joy and support, and what safety really does look like. And I also want to acknowledge, thank you, Dorma, for your comment on the dashboard and what it does and does not do with data in Indian country. And yeah, the dashboard is certainly not in a vacuum and doesn't answer all the questions. And in some instances, I agree, kind of lifts up the gaps that exist generally, and would love to work in partnership and hear from you and other and Native folks on the call of how we can build that into the dashboard in new and different ways, and if there are things that we're not seeing. So I appreciate this being kind of a launch to that conversation. Yeah, how can we include some self-reporting demographic data? How do we, and we've thought about this this feels like a future conversation. Can something like the dashboard be a place or a hub where we can kind of crowdsource or collect needed information on shared issue, on gap issues, a place for folks to share their experiences, and have it be built into the dashboard? That is a huge endeavor, and we need to think with all of you about how to do that, and how to make that meaningful. But there are incredible ways that I think that we can explore that. And so this really is just the start of the conversation, and looking forward to all of that. We are well over time, and I don't want to cut off conversation, but I also want to respect everybody's days and times, and thank you and extend a ton of gratitude for you all being here. Please do fill out that form. We are holding more in-depth kind of training and tutorials in October. So really want you to take the rest of this month to explore, to figure out what works, what doesn't, how else you might use it, give us some feedback so that we can dive in with you together in October to share more about what is in the dashboard and how we might use it, as well as engage with you to figure out what we can do to build in policy layers to fill in gaps that exist in some of the ways that have been lifted up today, and other things that we haven't thought of, but you have and you need, and how we can partner together to do that. So I welcome any last words from partners who showed up, to advocates, a collective, end of Wednesday whoop, or whatever would make you feel good hopping off this call. And thank you for being here, showing up and engaging with us.
Hey Sarah, it's Esmeralda from Niskatif. How are you?
Hi.
So I was about to write in the chat, but I'm just going to say here, I would love to also see, hopefully in the data, like the inequality among immigrants, like when it comes to public benefits, housing, because that's really huge. You know, there is an inequality among where they're at, you know, or where they live, among like childcare, housing, public benefits among medical, and it all depends on their immigration status.
Mhm.
And that'll be great to have.
That'd be wonderful. Yeah, let's talk more about where we could get some of that, how we could gather some of it, and what can be used in the meantime to at least paint the broad strokes around that. I appreciate. I'll make note of that and share it in the forum too if you can. So good to see and hear your voice.
Thank you so much. I'll look forward to that information. Thanks.
Thank you. I will reshare the form for those of you still hopping off. We'll also send this in an email with a link to the dashboard, so you'll get this by end of today. Thank you so much. Cheers all.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.